Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to my talk, Narrative Design for Mobile, Storytelling for the Very Small Screen. I've got 45 minutes for the session and I'm going to try and get the talk done in around 35, so we've got some time for questions at the end as well. So who am I to be talking about mobile and story? I've been working in the mobile space for about 9 years. Up until this year, my whole career was spent in various design roles, but I'm now a product lead at Mag Interactive, which means more focus on leading a game team, production, and product strategy. In my spare time, though, I still do lots of writing, and I'm currently working on a dating sim, along with a few other writing-heavy projects that are at various state of completion. And yeah, possibly the most relevant part, I have previous credits in narrative design. I've been a story consultant and a writer on a few different mobile games. And yeah, I just wanted to flip this around so I could get an idea of who's here today. Could I get people to put their hands up if they work in mobile, please? Okay, that's like maybe a third of the room, maybe a bit more. And then can I get people to put their hands up if they're a writer or a narrative designer on any type of platform? Okay, again, about a third. Now, who is a writer or designer specifically for mobile? Oh, only a few. Okay. Well, maybe we'll have more narrative designers for mobile at the end of this talk, but that's interesting. Okay, so narrative design is a really big topic, and I'm going to give a quick breakdown of what I'll be talking about. Yeah, so firstly, I'm going to give a quick rundown of the business case for adding story to your mobile game and what the cost and reward of doing so might be. I'll be talking about narrative structures that you commonly see in mobile games as well. And I'll dig specifically into the structure most common in casual games and the one that I'm personally most familiar with, the light narrative meta, the decoration. And I'll also talk a bit about how you can craft a story with specific metrics in mind. So mobile games are usually all about optimizing things like monetization and retention. And this can be done with the game's story just as much as it can be done with any other part of the game. And yeah, lastly, I'm going to summarize what we've learned from looking at the topics, and I'll also give you some extra things from my narrative toolkit that I always do. Right. So why are we going to add story to our mobile games? The market is really tough right now. If you're in mobile, you know this. And especially when it comes to launching new games, it's really hard to do it. For anyone who isn't familiar with the mobile space, Apple made some tracking changes to how we're able to target users for advertising. It's had a really big impact on the health of advertising in the games industry. So it's a much trickier climate to have your game be live or to launch a game especially. And any edge can really help your game out. If you can't target specific users, you can at least make sure that the advert is going to appeal to users you think will really enjoy your game and stick around and maybe spend some money. So story as a player motivation is really easy to convey in an advert because adverts are basically little stories. So you even see a lot of mobile game adverts using story as a device when their game doesn't actually have story at all. That's how good it is in adverts. So average daily usage for mobile phones in top markets is the highest it's ever been at 5 hours a day on average, which is wild. And players are playing games more than ever on their mobile. They're also expecting more as well. They want content and they're bouncing between multiple games to get what they're looking for. And doubling up on your content pipeline by also having a meta and story gives them more reason to stick around and be interested specifically in your game. Yeah, it also allows games to stand out in a really saturated market because there's loads of casual games out there. And if I'm looking to play a match 3 game, why wouldn't I just play whatever's top of my search? Or out of all the adverts I've seen, why is your game the one I download? When I have 5 minutes free, how do I choose which one I'm going to play? For me and a whole lot of other players, the swing factor there is a really good story. And then given that it's tricky to get users into your game in the first place these days, it's all the more essential to keep them around. So you're looking for healthy long-term retention, and you want players to still be playing in a month or a year after having downloaded the game. Story can help build up loyalty in the player base and keep your players waiting for the next update. I'm willing to bet that most of us have watched a TV series that's gone on for 5 series or longer, or waited for years for the next book in a series to come out. So if you can even just recreate that on a small scale and get the player wanting to come back between sessions or waiting for the next update, it just gives your game a bit more stickiness, which is a good thing. Doesn't necessarily sound good. So how many games in the top 100 grossing charts actually have story in them? I've had a look, and as of when I've made the slides, out of the top 100 grossing games chart, 26 of them had story. And in this case, I'm defining story as its own pipeline where new narrative content is being released. And 26 might not seem like that much, but if we think about the merge genre or the word genre, we're probably thinking that's quite big, like genres of mobile games. But for context, there's only 3 merge games in the top 100 and only 1 word game. So 26 story games is quite a lot. And then there were loads and loads of games that fell into this kind of like borderline area between story and no story. They had like named characters, a bit of lore, or some other really strong theming, maybe some narrative that was a one-off piece of work rather than a content pipeline being updated. There were 67 of those out of the 100, which I think is hugely significant, particularly when you consider that some of the games in the top 100 grossing are actually platforms for multiple different games like Roblox or casino games. And yeah, they're probably not going to have story in the same way, or at least I didn't count them as having story or theming. So yeah, these 67 games that are the most successful in our industry, they found story and theme important enough to do that work and to have it be a big part of how they sell their game to the player, which makes me think we should probably all think that story is quite important. So now that we've established story good, I'm going to give an overview as to the risks and rewards that go with it as well. It's a really heavy content pipeline, particularly if you're ambitious and you want to have a really high quality story, a decoration meta, characters. It's going to be a lot of work, and it's going to really bloat your team size. You're going to need localization, art requirements, script needs, implementation, testing, and your release schedule is going to need to be really sort of tight as well. So having been there doing the content, I can tell you it's a lot of work. You can minimize this work by giving less frequent story updates or a simpler story, less art assets, but the risk there is that the player isn't going to be satisfied by your game and they're going to go to a different one. Could more regular content updates or a higher quality story make you more money than it costs to make is a really good thing to weigh up. So you should look at like how much each update brings in revenue, and probably A/B test things like having a more minimized story and see what is the actual value that this is bringing. And how much does it cost to make? And then someone in a project manager role should probably weigh up those 2 things. And yeah, are your players going to move on to another game? That's the big concern with these things. You can also outsource your story, but at that point, you're really risking the quality of it. Or I guess some studios are using AI as well. And again, quality bad, but it allows you to deliver quick content, cheap. But again, if I'm a player, why would I not go to another game that's going to deliver a much higher quality story with the same free-to-play business model? If you end up with a story that's so low quality that your players don't engage with it, was it worth the cost of outsourcing or proofreading the AI? There's a lot to learn when you add story to your game, particularly when it's tied into a new content pipeline, as it typically is in mobile. Depending on the scope of your narrative and how tied into the meta it is, you might be having to work out how to deliver that content to players, which is a really tricky technical question, and how to manage a more intensive release schedule with bigger updates, how to implement the scenes, get the story written and localized, how to look at data for stories. And the pipeline of the art assets can be huge. So there's a lot to learn for a team that hasn't done it before. It's quite a big risk. Now moving on to the good things, the pros. We've already talked about user acquisitions and marketing being tricky these days and the popularity of story-focused ads. So ads with an engaging story tend to perform really well. But if players download the game and find that it's nothing like the ad, they're not going to stick around. If they see that the characters and themes that were shown in the ad are in fact in the game, then they're more likely to engage and find out more about what drew them to that advert. Plus, the story pipeline usually generates loads of creative ideas for advertising and loads of assets to use as well, which can be really useful for your marketing team. We've already talked about it, but strong retention games is the golden goose, I guess, of story. And yeah, if your story pipeline is working well, you're going to have much better long-term retention and a really loyal player base as well. If they want to keep playing and find out what happens next, then you're doing it right. There's also untapped monetization potential in storytelling in mobile games. If you want to look at the sort of area of mobile games that is tapping into this monetization potential the best, I suggest looking at games like Episode or the Arcana, where they monetize choices. But even then, I don't think they're doing it as well as we could do. It's a really strong driver to get to what happens next in a story. And as someone who has been a well for these types of story games, there's definitely a lot of money that you can get out of your players. And the players who find the story compelling are going to be driven forward by that, which is also sort of shows that they're enjoying it as well. And lastly, it's a way to diversify in an oversaturated market. So there's so much potential in storytelling and so little variation in the market right now. You've all got the same kind of template of a story. So if you do something different, you're really going to stand out. And players who don't want the same story are going to be really intrigued by that and really interested in checking out your game. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Cool. So yeah, I'm briefly going to talk about different structures that can be found in mobile games. Ooh, yeah, this is the one I'm going to talk about the most, the classic light narrative or the decoration meta. It's definitely the most popular in the casual space. And it usually has the classic loop of earning currency in the core gameplay and then spending that on story and decorations in the meta. This structure is going to be the one I focus on for the rest of the talk, so I won't talk about loads at this point. This structure is very similar to the light narrative decoration meta one, but each story is focused around a job. You can see it in games like Project Makeover or SpaceX's new game, Chrome Valley Customs. The loop is that you earn currency in the core, and then you spend it to do a job which has some story attached to it. It's very similar to the decoration meta, but the difference is once the job is over, usually the upgrades you've been doing go away. And the story is sort of more modular to reflect that as well. You might have some overarching narrative, but usually it's one smaller story as well, focused around that job or that customer. Then you have your sort of RPG style storytelling that's quite common in mid-core games. The story is usually there to serve the progression rather than the progression being there to serve the story. The focus is on building your army or leveling up your characters, and the narrative is just kind of gravy on top of that. Typically, it's more focused on lore than any kind of interpersonal narratives, and the story is often delivered in like item descriptions or loading menus or character bios. So that one sort of drifts into the theme category I was talking about earlier when I was looking through the different games. Lastly, you have your episodes-like structure, which I talked about a little bit before, where the player is going through a visual novel style game, and often specific choices will be gated by monetization. In this case, the story is the core rather than being secondary to some other kind of gameplay. And you could say that this type of game is more of a gamified story than an actual game, depending on your view on that. Quite a few of these are actually platforms for various stories rather than just one individual story game. For instance, Episode has a whole bunch of stories on it. It's got like a community hub, and it's got, I think you can actually create the stories in the app as well. But that said, there are also games in this style that are just individual stories like the Arcana, and some that are a curated collection of stories that were all made by the studio, like Time Princess, which is really good. So check that one out. So what are some of the key differences we need to have in mind when we're writing stories for mobile games? With most players, you can expect them to be paying less attention when they're playing a mobile game than they would to a premium PC game or a console game or to a TV show. Casual games are, by their nature, more casual. It's not so much that the players don't have the ability to focus on the story or engage at a deeper level. It's just that where you put mobile gaming into your life is usually in a more casual space. They fit into gaps in our lives when we have 5-minute breaks or when we're watching TV and there's like a boring part. So we need to keep that in mind when we're writing. There's a test in mobile game design that's called the Starbucks test, where you ask yourself, could I play the game and order a coffee at the same time? And if you're writing for a mobile game, you should also ask yourself, can I play the game and get the gist of the story and order a coffee at the same time? Because if you can't, it's probably too complicated. So this one's a double whammy. You have character limits in the sense of how many characters you can actually fit on the screen, because it's a small screen and the UI is more compact because of that. But you also have fewer characters in the sense that you're probably not going to have a huge cast of characters because the art pipeline that's required to make them, and you're probably going to have only one location to work with throughout the entire story. So you need to make that location very versatile so it can work for your story in lots of different ways. You need to make those characters very versatile so they can evolve and continue to be interesting to the player all the way through. Story needs to mesh well around the core. You want the cutscenes to be fairly brief so that you can steer the player back to the core and keep them in that loop. You also want to have some level of cohesion between the narrative, meta, and core. For instance, you wouldn't want to have a sci-fi story and then be collecting candies in the core. It would just be a bit weird and dissonant. With a live mobile game, the lifespan is however long you can be profitable for. So you want to set up your story to be a never-ending story. I like to try and take lessons from soap operas with this. So you have storylines that conclude, but you always pepper in cliffhangers and write without an end in sight. In terms of like making sure that you keep storylines open, there's I think it's a website called Project Horseshoe that shows the different types of narrative structure you can look at. And I didn't cite it here just because it's a little bit different again for soap operas and then different again for mobile games that take lessons from soap operas. But it's a good one to look at for like a starting point to get an idea of how that works. So yeah, one of the really cool things you can do with mobile games is keep changing the story after the game is launched. It's really great because you can keep iterating. You can look at player response and improve. One fairly extreme example is the game on the right, Garden Affairs, which completely rewrote its story a few years post-launch and then relaunched the game with a big advertising campaign to show off the new story. The adverts are great. I haven't actually played it, but it looks good. And yeah, the other really great thing is that you have access to live data, usually a lot of live data, depending on how many players you've got, which can be really useful when it comes to informing those edits that I mentioned in the previous points. If you can see there's a certain point in the storyline where players begin skipping cutscenes or they're churning away from the game, you know that there's probably something happening that's losing players. So I have a few examples for us to run through now to see how this all stands up in action. And I'm going to start with homescapes, which is like the mother of the decoration light narrative genre, along with gardenscapes. So originally, homescapes had an opening cutscene, something that quite a few games have these days, but it was later removed. So we can assume that enough players dropped off and stopped playing at that point that Playrix thought it would just be better for them to get rid of it. You've got a sort of fresh start in that Austin the butler is moving back to his childhood home and needing to renovate it. He's kind of a blank slate, fairly bland character, and the player can project onto him. But he is quite an odd choice for a protagonist in this kind of game. But Playrix likely used him because he was an established character already in Gardenscapes. Or maybe they tested him with advertising and it was weird enough that people wanted to play the game. There's a bit of mild drama with a love interest turning up and Austin's parents selling their ancestral home, but it's fairly low-key and not the focus. There's the hallmark setup as well, with the narrative providing a never-ending to-do list. In terms of how the story is conveyed to players, you have animation on the map, expressions for the characters in the chat. Austin talks to himself as well as talking to other characters, and each task is structured around a decoration or removing some rubbish. Having the visual storytelling in place works really well for the split attention that I mentioned earlier. It can also draw in players that were previously not interested in the story, but they see something happening on their screen that just piques their interest enough to draw them into it. The ads for Homescapes are effectively all focused on mini games these days, from what I've seen, which is probably another data-led decision from Playrix, showing that the story ads don't perform as well for them these days for some reason. It might be to do with the main character, or it might be to do with the saturation from how often people have seen these ads, because Playrix's UA budget is so huge, maybe they just need to continue to rotate and change things. The story is super simple, there aren't many characters, and there isn't much drama. The story is really more of a vehicle for decorating, as opposed to something like Love and Pies, where I'd say the decorating is a vehicle for the story. Next up is another prolific example, Merge Mansion. For Merge Mansion, there's an opening cinematic and a bespoke cutscene sequence, both of which were added to the game quite a while after launch. You've got Maddie as a blank slate, any woman sort of character, and she has a semi-fresh start in which she's discovered the family mansion and she's restoring it. There's some interpersonal drama, you've got family secrets, romance, breakups, and again, you've got the classic to-do list setup. You're starting to see the similarities. The components of how the story is told is very similar to Homescapes. The map animations, chat expressions, and so on, Maddie talking to herself and to other characters, and each task you're either decorating or cleaning. The only difference I'd call out is that the visuals are a bit lower polished than Homescapes, and the rest of games that have this kind of like narrative decoration meta, which is a bit at odds with how high budget the game actually is. But given that there are still changes being made to the story, it could be that they're just waiting to see where the chips fall there and going to make a bigger pass later on. So it's interesting to me that the story is still being reworked 3 years post-launch. This is the kind of doctoring and refining that we expect with core gameplay, but it's a little bit more surprising to see it happen with the meta. You can actually see how the ads for the game have really fed into the story as well. If you look at App Magic, you can timestamp when the advert with the grandma having the hand on the car window in the police car. A few months after that ad launched, and presumably they got the data saying that it was really, really interesting to people and drawing them in, they then changed the App Store page to change the story to focus on family secrets and what is Granny hiding. So you can see that the story was changed off the back of that. They've also done some really out-the-box things with how they use story in their adverts. They've had live action ads with Pedro Pascal and Kathy Bates, which is totally just out there and really interesting to see for a mobile game. I've got no idea how successful these adverts are, but I think the success of the story focused ads has really pushed them to try and do more with the story in the game. So my last example is Lily's Garden, which is one of the games I'd hold up as a gold standard for mobile storytelling. You've got a great opening sequence that has brilliant visual storytelling. Lily is the classic blank slate protagonist, and she gets the fresh start. The game has buckets of interpersonal drama, and of course you have the non-stop to-do list of fixing up the house and the gardens as well. So even though all these examples are very similar, I would say look at them and see the difference, because to me, and in my opinion, Lily's Garden does this by far the best out of those three. The components of how the story is told are pretty much the same as Homescapes and Merge Mansion, so I won't repeat them. But the only added factor that Lily's Garden has is that there are occasionally illustrations as well that come up in the cutscenes. Historically, the advertising for Lily's Garden was overwhelmingly story-focused, but recently they've moved towards some mini-game style ads as well, following that trend. The story ads have super dramatic situations and lots of risque humor, which is echoed in the story, but not to the same extent as the ads. When it comes to a cast of characters, out of all the examples, I'd say Lily's Garden has the best setup with a fairly large set of characters, and they all have exaggerated traits and flaws, which makes them perfect for long-term storytelling that's at this kind of like less attention-focused level. In terms of the advertising change, it's quite an interesting case study to look at because the adverts are very well documented. Similar to Merge Mansion, they had like a little fan community just around the adverts. So I take a look at how they used to be and how they are now. It might be because the cost of producing these types of adverts was too high compared to the actual reward of running them, that they changed to more mini game focus, or it could be, again, to do with the saturation and how much they've spent, having all the players that are going to actually be more interested in the game through those adverts already come through. Earlier on, I talked about how important retention is and how the story can affect it. And now I'm going to run through some tips on how you can specifically write your story with retention in mind. You can use your live data, once again, once the game is launched, to look at where retention drops off and see if any unexpected dips line up with particular plot points. Each update of story content should end with a cliffhanger. The pacing of updates makes stories in mobile games inherently episodic. So to go for this kind of cliffhanger, you'd get the nice ending of like a soap opera episode, and that works really well. And because the story is so long running, you're aiming to engage players over a really long-term period. Recap what's happened between content updates and keep them in the loop about what's already gone on, just because it's such a long story and something they're going to be playing in 5-minute bursts. Not many games do this at all, but one of the few examples is on the right here, Storyington Hall. It has a nice feature where you can collect observations about each character, and it doubles up as a collection feature, but also gives you some reminders of what's happened in the story and who the characters are. Lastly, if you have the resources, special storylines for end-of-content players could be a really compelling way to drive players towards the end of an update as quickly as possible. Mobile games sometimes have end-of-content gameplay to try and keep their players engaged once they've finished everything in the update. And an end-of-content story could work in the same way, something lighter than the main storyline with less assets tied to it, but giving players something to work towards that's a sort of secondary pipeline. Monetization is also super important, so here are my tips for storytelling with monetization in mind. You can gate story behind an iApp, and the way I'd suggest doing that is by having side stories rather than by gating off the main storyline. Because if players feel like the storyline is blocked by paying, like the main optimum storyline, it's not going to be a very positive experience for them, and it's going to kind of sour their relationship with the story and with the game. The Arcana, the game that I'm showing on the right, does this quite well in that they have paid choices, but it always feels like extra content or side stories rather than being essential to the main storyline. You can not spend and you can still get a good experience from that game. So you feel like you're getting something extra for spending rather than missing out by not spending, which is really important for just player perception. There's a lot of untapped potential with monetization for story and casual games, particularly in like a decoration meta. Side stories have huge potential to unlock this, but cosmetic items as well, different outfits for the characters can be really compelling. Make sure that you line up your best cliffhangers on a beat-to-beat level with the harder or more expensive tasks. It's a nice way to marry up the core and the meta together, and it pushes monetization in the core of the game because of the desire to reach the next part of the story. Lastly, it's also just worth pointing out that the more retention you have, the more people will spend eventually because the lifetime value of players will go up. They're around for longer, and so they've got more opportunities to spend. My last topic is creating a storyline with a long, open-ended shelf life that can match the lifespan of your game. I highly suggest looking at soap operas and telenovelas to see how they stagger their cliffhangers, multiple strands of storytelling, and the types of tropes that they use and the types of characters they use. There are really great examples of storylines designed for a long time and only require a little bit of simplifying to work for a casual audience. Make sure that you always have one major storyline left open. The player shouldn't ever come away feeling like all of their questions are answered. If you close off one big storyline, you need to have the groundwork in place already for the next one. End your cutscene and your content updates with cliffhangers. It's really, really good way to just keep people in that loop. And most importantly, in my opinion, you need to have chaos-creating characters in your character lineup. Edwina from Love and Pies is a great example of this. She's an antagonist who becomes a frenemy, but no matter how hostile or not she is towards the main character, she's always creating chaos because she's got a very ambitious and ruthless personality. So she creates chaos based on those traits and the sort of things that she does because of them. And another example for different reasons is Lily's mum in Lily's Garden. She's like really flaky, not antagonistic, but just always creating problems that Lily needs to solve. If you have a game that's running for loads and loads of updates, loads of chapters, and only a limited cast, you need to have problems continue to come along. And the best way to do that is to have characters that are troublemakers. So I'm just going to recap some of the key takeaways now. Get an experienced narrative designer on your team early in development, especially if your team hasn't created a game with story before. They'll be really vital to the game's development and just giving an overlay of what needs to happen for that kind of content pipeline to be put in place. Lean on the data pipeline and UA when you're testing your story concepts. It can feel a bit at odds with the writing process to use quantitative data, but once you get used to it, it's just super useful in seeing how audiences react to different themes or different characters. So I would highly suggest embracing that resource if you have it available to you. Write your story like it's a soap opera or a telenovela. And I've literally just mentioned this one, but you want your chaos-creating characters. Try and work out how much each update of the story costs and what it brings you in terms of value and how it impacts your metrics. If you can sort of work out the cost versus the value, then it can make you help really strong decisions around the content release cadence and lobbying for new features that involve story. I wouldn't necessarily say this is the narrative designer's job, but if you've got a content lead or a head of product, they might want to be the one who does this. It's just a really useful thing for any game team to do. Big risks can yield big rewards, especially when it comes to trying to stand out in a saturated market. Switchcraft, for example, is a pretty unique game in that the story is very high quality, the plot is a bit more involved, and it stands apart from the typical light narrative. It doesn't really follow the same tropes. It also has LGBT plus romance options, and all of these factors have allowed them to attract a new portion of the market by getting younger players and underserved LGBT plus players. And it's created a deeply loyal fan base off the back of this with really strong long-term retention. Recap the story. I don't think I know any games that do a proper catch-up feature, and it's such a shame because narrative costs so much to make, and a feature that recaps it would be a one-off piece of work that would continually provide value by letting players get more out of the story and stay engaged. So please do this. Don't rely on just text to draw on players. You need to use visuals as well. You're contending with split attention and some players who don't even want to read a story. So by illustrating all the amazing story beats you have, you're continuing to grab players' attentions or give them a different way of engaging with the story. Each line should be succinct and snappy. Players don't want to read loads, and the small screen will start to look cluttered with too many words. When I'm proofreading scripts for mobile, I usually look at each word and ask myself, is that word necessary in the sentence? And I also go through each scene on a line-by-line basis and ask myself, what is it bringing to the overall scene? So yeah, that's me. Thank you. Oh, if there's any questions, we have time.
Thank you very much. Hello. Thank you very much. You said a couple of times about the recap and the fact that this isn't a very done thing. I'm just curious, is this something that do you think has to be done specifically in the game between the content life cycle, the content cycles, or is that also something that can be brought into the advertisement of the next content that's coming for the game, or is that something that players just aren't going to look at?
So there's a sort of separate thing there that you're touching on a bit, which is re-engagement advertising. So again, Lily's Garden is an example I know of for this, because I was playing it and I stopped and they started advertising their new storyline to me. So I went back for that. It requires quite a lot of segmentation, I think, and you need to know quite a lot about the players you're targeting to do it well. But in terms of what I meant when I was talking about recapping, I kind of just meant like what you get at the beginning of an episode where it's like last time. I think having it between updates makes a lot of sense because usually that's when the players would have paused. But you could also just look at how long it's been since the player last played and do a sort of contextual update based on that, or even just let them read back through the chats. So someone showed me when I was running through my slides and practicing, I think it's Professor Layton does an example of this, where there's like a little catch-up thing that comes up. And it just shows you like the main notes on the story that happened. It's probably a bit harder to do that kind of feature in a mobile game just because the story is so long and it's continually being updated, but something like that would work really well.
Cheers, thank you. That was an excellent talk. I really enjoyed that. I had two questions. One was quite similar to that, like about catch-up feature, so I'll gloss over that. A lot of people talk about the value, etc., of mobile in general. And they talk about, like, everyone's talking about hyper casualization and hyper casual games and things like that. And I have to say that leaves me a bit cold. What do we have any like numbers? Because my perception is that companies like Mega Interactive or Wooga, they're actually quite big companies that no one ever really talks about. Is there any like numbers on sort of like what the vague value of this kind of narrative mobile market is? Because it's quite established and it has been around for a while. Is there any more like sort of details there?
Yeah, honestly, I tried to look into this a bit when I was preparing for the talk, and I couldn't really find anything. I do have some knowledge from having previously worked for Trailmix about how much the story was worth to them, but I'm obviously not going to share that because there's one of them in the room. But
he's all recorded. You should be careful anyway.
But yeah, what I can say is what's public knowledge, and they have talked about how the story created a huge amount of value for them, and how there was a real turning point in the soft launch after testing new story. So yeah, it's a good thing to have.
Hi. You mentioned briefly about like possibility of outsourcing story. You were very negative about that. I was wondering kind of what have you seen that went wrong with that?
It's partly because I'm a writer, but I feel very negative about it. I guess having been in-house and having mentored a lot of freelancers who've been in that sort of pay by the word situation, I guess on a personal level, it feels like people aren't particularly treated well for that work. It's also usually not people who are super experienced. Depending on the outsourcing team as well, they might not be writing in the first language because some of them are based overseas. And yeah, the quality does just tend to tank a bit. I don't want to name any specific examples, but they are out there.
Just to follow up on this, so what's a good model to pay freelancers? Because you said make it short and snappy, and then if we're paying them per word, we're creating conflict of interest. So how do we?
Yeah, I mean, there is a conflict of interest there. And I think that that's probably why a lot of companies that do use freelancers in that way have a quite strict style guide about how many words per line and things like that. I guess if you want to look at companies that tend to do that sort of stable of freelancers that get paid as low as they can per word, episodes and choices and ones like them tend to do that. But yeah, I guess having an in-house person means that you don't have that split loyalty there between wanting to write as quickly as possible and get paid for word as quickly as possible. You're more all in with the game and able to work on the other parts that surround the whole content team rather than just the story, which has been something I've seen a lot of value in my career.
Hiya. First of all, thank you so much for that talk. It was really insightful. My question is about like balancing, I guess, narrative design with the mechanics that you have. So you're saying like player retention and keeping it short and snappy, that players don't really like to read a lot, but like games such as the Arcana are very story heavy, and like Switchcraft, although it has the match 3 component, is story heavy at times. I guess it's just like, how do you balance that, especially like when it comes to like the endless task kind of games? I feel they're probably more mechanic or core loop kind of focused. So I guess I just wanted to pick your brains on like balancing the narrative with the core loop of that repetitive task, and how to keep that player retention between 2 very different dynamics.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because when I was saying about keeping things short and snappy, I was sort of more thinking about the light narrative games with the decoration specifically. But Switchcraft and the Arcana, they're great examples of games that have a much more, I guess they're going for people who are more invested in story. And so they're giving a bigger reward for that investment. With the Arcana, the core is the story, so you don't have to balance it in quite the same way, but I guess you have to balance the monetization with the player experience. And I guess the way I would suggest doing that is by having more sort of sideways things that you pay for, rather than feeling like you have to pay to progress on what the clearly best storyline is. I think a bad example of this is some of the games that episodes have, where you have to pay to be popular, which feels a bit toxic. And the other part of your question was about balancing between core and story, And I think with Switchcraft, it's just them knowing their player base, and possibly they've A/B tested less story, more core. I don't know if they have, but it would make sense to me. But yeah, I think it's just about seeing what your player base wants, and community management can be a useful way of doing that. Seeing how they're reacting to the story can give you really good qualitative data. And I think in terms of how I've wanted them to balance together before, looking at those sort of like more interesting parts of the story, and then maybe requiring a bit more core interaction off the back of that, whether it's a level that needs loads of attempts or a more expensive task. I think that works because you're offering a bigger carrot for the sake of going through the core gameplay. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Thank you for that talk. It's really insightful. I was going to ask a question in relation to sort of combining the narrative, but with also the user experience. Where do you find within your story's progression, typically, that you find the most informing opportunities to understand where your players want to progress in the narrative and where they don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's quite hard to work out how to look at that from a qualitative and quantitative point of view. In my experience, looking at multi-session playtest clouds can be really useful for seeing players go on that story journey a little bit. But I also just get my family to play the game and then watch them and their reactions, and try and make notes on that. But from a quantitative data point of view, it's really hard because most game studios don't really know how to measure that kind of story data. You can look at things like how often they're skipping different tasks and where that variance is, because you'll have a baseline where it's like, oh, a certain chunk of the player base is always going to skip, but on this story beat, it's 5% more. You could look at like the ping time as well, for how long they're in a cutscene for, and whether that makes a difference to other sort of metrics together. I think looking at the 2 metrics in conjunction, like ping time in the story and churn together, for instance, could be a good way to try and see what relationship is there. But it is tricky. It's a whole undertaking to try and work that out. And of the companies I've worked with, I don't think there's been one that's mastered it particularly yet. I think it's still relatively new territory.
Have you found that any sort of particular stages have they're more obvious to you within your experiences, that right, we can actually define those now?
Yeah, I think the early funnel is the easiest thing to look at on that sort of beat by beat level, because you've got less that you need to be thinking about different variables of, oh, the player might just have churned from the game anyway at this point. But you can see different interactions through the funnel and how many people you've got there still. So yeah, when you're looking for like day one retention, it's a bit easier to see then how the story impacts it. But as you sort of take a step away and look at a bigger picture, it does get a bit harder.
Oh, hello. Hi there. So I don't write for mobile at all yet, but one of the things that you pointed out was cliffhangers being very important. Is that seen as a bit of a cliche, or is there another way to incorporate cliffhanger-like type things in it, or what?
Personally, I would say that I don't really go to casual mobile games for like the more highbrow storytelling. I sort of go to other stuff for that as a reader and a player. And as a writer, I don't go there to do my more interesting, subverting the narrative work. I guess cliches and tropes are very much the popular thing that's in mobile, and it's the easier thing to write, but it also falls into players' expectations. So if their attention isn't fully on it, it's really easy for them to then tune back into that story. I think it's got a place. It's a type of itch that is specific. And yeah, you can do something more interesting like that. You could do a Monument Valley type game or the Arcana or episodes. It's just at that point, it's a different product and you'd be working with it in a different way. So a lot of this advice would no longer apply. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, slightly left field question since the focus is on casual mobile games, but would you have any tips for games that aren't as character heavy, that are kind of maybe more PvP and cosmetic focused, on how to infuse narrative in those scenarios a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that's sort of where you almost want to look at. So in one of the earlier slides I had, I talked a little bit about the sort of RPG style storytelling where the story is like extra gravy on top of the progression. It's the vehicle to encourage you along to progress more, to build your army or level up your characters, rather than the story being the reward and progression being a side thing. So in that case, I would suggest doing things like having more lore rather than like specific cutscenes, and focusing on things like item descriptions and character bios and stuff like that. I think that can work quite well, particularly in mid-core games. Yeah. I think it's time. Yeah, okay. Thank you, everyone.